Good afternoon. A very warm welcome to everyone to our 19th William Pitt Seminar. It's wonderful for us all to be able to be in this great new space that we've created as part of our new Mill Lane development. The William Pitt Seminar has a history of tackling really interesting and important issues and tackling them in a really intelligent and exciting way. And this afternoon will be no exception to that. Before I do a proper welcome to our speakers, can I just say there is no fire alarm scheduled for this afternoon. If a fire alarm does happen, please exit through the foyer and into Chew Court just outside the foyer. And hopefully none of that will be necessary. But today we are looking at the issue of intergenerational fairness, bridging the gap between old and young, thinking about fairness between different generations and ages in our human journey. And who better to lead us through these issues than two dames, four professors, a vice-chancellor, and a brilliant recent student. We are going to be hosted and chaired this afternoon by our vice-chancellor, Debbie Prentice. Debbie, over to you, and welcome.
Between young and old to create a fairer and more successful society. So to help us answer some of these questions, we have four distinguished speakers. Their full biographies are in the program, so I won't embarrass them by going into great detail about their many achievements. But I'd like to bring them up here, and I will introduce them while they're sitting on the stage. Why don't we come bring our panelists up? Okay, so I'll do it in the order I have it here. So Professor Dame Diane Coyle, Bennett Professor of Public Policy and co-director of the Bennett Institute for Public Policy, where she heads research under the themes of progress and productivity. Diane has authored over 200 articles and 10 books, her latest being Cogs and Monsters, What Economics Is and What It Should Be. And her forthcoming is The Measure of Progress, Counting What Really Matters. Lorraine Gelsthorpe is an emeritus professor of criminology and criminal justice at the Institute of Criminology, University of Cambridge. Lorraine was director of the Institute of Criminology from 2017 to 2022. She's a chair of the National Probation Institute and sits on various government advisory committees. Prashanti Sen completed her undergraduate degree in psychological and behavioral sciences at Pembroke College and is currently pursuing a master's in child development and education at the University of Oxford. She founded her most recent project, Pembroke Panels, in her final undergraduate year at the University of Cambridge. Pembroke Panels is a lifelong education and action initiative designed inclusively for all to explore and positively impact global legacies in health and humanitarianism. And finally, Professor Dame Henrietta Moore, Honorary Fellow, Founder and Director of the Institute for Global Prosperity, from where she challenges traditional economic models of growth, arguing that communities need to engage with diversity and work within environmental limits to flourish. Her recent policy work focuses on new economic models, universal basic services, artificial intelligence, environmental degradation and decarbonization, displaced people, and the gender pay gap. So those are our speakers, and I'm going to start by asking Diane to share her thoughts with us today.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and it's great to see everybody here today. We're being trusted to drive our own microphones. Can you hear me? Fantastic. So it's a great honour to be asked to take part in this. My father was a church elder and my brother's a lay preacher. I'm kind of tempted to go up to the pulpit and speak from there, but I'll stay here instead. In 1858, the River Thames was afflicted by the Great Stink. There'd been so much sewage poured into the river that it smelt so bad that Parliament had to stop sitting, the House of Commons being right on the river there. And so in 1859, MPs voted the money for Joseph Bazalgette to build London sewers. And he built over 150 years' worth of capacity. If you drive along the embankment now, you can see the Thames Tideway Tunnel, the expansion of capacity only just being constructed. Sadly, we're sort of back to mid-Victorian times in the amount of sewage that we're putting in Britain's rivers. But I often think about the Victorians because they built so much of the infrastructure and housing that we're still using in this country. And I often ponder about that mindset that meant that they could build for many future generations. They built roads and railways, they built town halls, they built art galleries and libraries, they built a lot of the housing stock that we're still using here. And we seem to have lost that. The schools and hospitals that were built in the 1960s and 70s are falling down. We can't build houses. So we have created a huge debt that future generations are going to have to repay. They are going to have to build all of that infrastructure. Our Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, is being lobbied on all sides for the funds that will fill tens of billions of pounds worth of gap in investment. The UK has been much lower in its investment as a share of GDP than all of the countries we'd like to compare ourselves with, not just for 10 years, but for 40 years. We're just not investing here. There's a huge debt in housing. That housing stock that we're using is inefficient, decaying, not environmentally efficient, and we haven't built enough. And we see that in the house prices that everybody pays. So we boomers, and I'm at the tail end of the boomer generation, are sitting on lovely assets that have appreciated in price over time, and our children and grandchildren are paying the price for that. There's also an absolutely enormous natural debt. When the economies of the West came out of the Second World War, it was very clear that the shortages were physical infrastructure and the loss of human capital. And so not surprisingly, attention focused on that kind of building. But it means that since the late 1940s, our economies have been using natural resources for free. There's been no price on them. And even if you think it's incredibly difficult or even immoral to price nature, we have been pricing it. We've been pricing it at zero. And that means that not only climate change, but the loss of biodiversity, the decaying of food chains, the crumbling of soil quality that will hit agricultural productivity and our ability to feed ourselves all of that natural debt is huge and potentially catastrophic. And so here we are in 2024, for the first time in a quarter of a millennium, leaving future generations worse off. And this is exactly the reverse of what has come to seem the natural order of things since at least the Industrial Revolution, and actually for centuries before that too, that we all struggle to make our children and grandchildren better off. Future generations should be better off. So if you think about the stresses on the younger people now, they are intense. There's been a lot of debate about whether it's social media. I think it's a real mistake to focus on social media as a sole cause, because young people, as I said, can't find places to live very easily. They spend their school careers and their university careers often just worrying about getting the grades that they're going to need in a competitive job market. The job market itself isn't only competitive, it's almost impossible if you don't have the right formal educational qualifications. And that the methods of the hoops that we make people jump through to apply for jobs now are simply extraordinary. Many of you will have had children who've been going through that. So not surprisingly, this country has 870,000 young people who are not in employment, education or training. It's up by about a quarter since 2022. And the mental health burden, partly due to the pandemic, of course, but partly due to these wider stresses that we have created for them, we boomers, have led to an epidemic of mental ill health. Now, some of these phenomena apply to other countries too. Some of them are much worse in the UK than elsewhere. So I'm not sure I would frame it as intergenerational conflict, but I do think there's a real change in values in the younger generation, and really what a good thing that is, because we've made such a mess of it. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Is that better? Yes. Thank you. Well, I want to speak about two particular themes. The first relates to intergenerational conflict in relation to crime, and the second relates to mental health. I am a criminologist, but I'm also a counsellor and a psychoanalytic psychotherapist as well. So both things are close to my heart. First, criminology and intergenerational conflict. The flyer for this seminar indicated that more than ever, the perceived conflict between generations is coming to the fore. Well, is it? Let me read you some statements about young people. Our young people have no idea of discipline or subordination. Over the past 20 years or so, there's been a revulsion from authority and discipline. A fearful multitude of untutored savages, boys with dogs at their heels and other evidence of dissolute habits, girls who drive carts, coal carts, ride astride upon horses, drink, swear, fight, smoke, whistle, and care for nobody. The morals of children are tenfold worse than formerly. And then children who've been brought up within these 30 years have nothing like the same reverence or submission for their parents. This is the chief cause of the increase in crime. Well, when do you think these statements were made? They could have come from today's newspapers, of course, but the first one was a magistrate in 1814. The second one, David Cameron, former Prime Minister, in 2014. And the statement about untutored savages, that was Anthony Ashley Cooper, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, in a speech to the House of Commons in 1843. The last statement comes from Mrs. Thatcher, former Prime Minister, in 1986. Well, historically, youth have always been a problem. Of course, the very concept of childhood and youth have changed over time. The invention of the concept of adolescence and troublesome youths is usually attributed to Rousseau, writing in the 1760s. He likened adolescence to a second birth and viewed it principally as a period of emotional turmoil, which led to various forms of moral degeneration, and most particularly sexual precociousness. Unsupervised leisure has almost always been a major source of trouble and as posing a threat to young people's moral development. During the 16th and 17th centuries, carnivals were accused of promoting sexual promiscuity, and popular ballads were denounced as being bawdy and as glorifying criminality. By the 19th century, theatre, music halls, dances, penny dreadfuls, cheap newspaper fiction, street football, gambling, and other forms of popular entertainment were all subject to intense campaigns to halt their supposed contamination of youth. The word yob derives from the late 19th century as backslang for boys, members of street gangs. The word hooligan entered common English usage during the summer of 1898, Peaky Blinders in Birmingham, and Icky Boys and Scuttlers in Manchester. Following rowdyism on the August bank holiday in 1898, hundreds of people were brought to court on charges of assault, drunkenness, and attacks on police officers. In the 20th century, another dangerous enemy was discovered in the new medium of the Hollywood cinema. Youth leisure pursuits from 1950s onwards have been subject to adult censure, moral panic, and regulation. We've seen teddy boys, mods and rockers, skinheads, and more. Broadly speaking, youth can be portrayed as a site of secondary socialization, during which young people develop clearer ideas about their future position in the social order. Early fears of young people, youth culture, can be placed in the context of the Industrial Revolution, long before too, of course, but in that context, and other major changes in social life. At the end of the 19th century, we see structural decline in established industries, trade depression, a shortage of housing, and a bourgeois fear of socialism. In other words, these preoccupations with youth disorder are invariably associated with wider social tensions. So what of the 21st century? My final note on crime. For many decades, youth crime was used to peak within the penultimate year of leaving school. So the peak age of crime was 14, when the school leaving age was 15. 15 for a while, when 16 became the school leaving age. Interestingly, the peak ages of offending are now 19 for males and 17 for females. But youth crime can be seen as intergenerational conflict if we accept that youth is a metaphor for social change and that older generations are fearful of change. This is perhaps simplistic, though, because it's important to think about intersectional conflicts, including social, cultural, and moral values, rather than conflicts which solely revolve around age. My three main points, then. Youth can be seen as a metaphor for social change, and older generations are fearful of change, but age differences are not the only factors to consider. Both criminal behaviour and attitudes to criminal justice may be transmitted intergenerationally, but there are complexities, push factors towards crime and pull factors away from it. Intergenerational conflict, well, is generational conflict coming to the fore? It's not a new phenomenon. We just need to look at the social context in order to understand it. Let me turn to mental health then, briefly. Broadly speaking, in the last 125 years, we've seen enormous technological changes, as well as social, economic, demographic changes in British society. 120 years ago, at a rally in Newark, New Jersey, the mayor held up a telephone and said, "I foresee the day when every town and city in America will have one of these." I wonder how many mobile phones we could put together between us this afternoon. In the last 75 years in particular, we've seen family and community changes, with new configurations of families, new conceptions of community. We may not know our neighbours, but we can speak to our friends on the far side of the world within minutes. And we can engage in social media with others all day long if we like. We've seen economic changes with the globalisation of markets, a switch from producer to consumer-oriented capitalism, and deindustrialization. There's cheaper labour elsewhere. We've seen new social movements, the development of neoliberalism and suspicion of the state as a provider, and the notion of the big society, of course, pulling back, rolling back the state. We've also seen the development of a culture of control, a victimological turn, a punitive turn, risk aversion, a culture of risk, a culture of individualism, and what Zygmunt Bauman calls liquid modernity. Bauman suggests that over the last 100 years, solid modernity has gradually been transformed into liquid modernity, which entails living without an ultimate perfect model of society, where individual life reflects the experience of being in an increasingly deregulated or flexible world, a world full of the uncoordinated, often contradictory chances and voices, but devoid of clear-cut standards by which the superiority of any of them can be measured. And in regard to social relationships are continually up for grabs because they're constantly being made, undone and remade. Indeed, these days, I have learned, people often enter situationships rather than relationships, with expectation that nothing lasts forever. Jock Young refers to the vertigo, the dizziness of all these changes in social, economic, political life. No wonder there is a perception of a crisis of mental health amongst young people, as well as others. We can throw in global threats and wars around the world into the mix as well, of course, with knowledge of at least 110 conflict zones in the world, and of course, COVID. The challenges of modern 21st century life and living are enormous. Financial crises, housing crises for some families, hate crime, racism, sexism, environmental crises, we could go on. But is there a new crisis in relation to mental health? Do young people today experience greater challenges in relation to mental health than hitherto? As a college counsellor, I'm frequently reminded of the difficulties which students experience when returning home after the end of each term, with well-meaning parents telling them what they should eat and when they ought to go to bed. For many students, their newfound independence is immediately eroded. But more often than not, any intergenerational conflict is compounded by differences in values, cultural habits and mores, and newly created lifestyles. I'm hugely sympathetic to young people who have mental health difficulties with or without clinical diagnoses. Yes, in contemporary society, many young people have it tough. A scarcity of jobs, challenges of social media, a shortage of affordable housing, disaffection because of social exclusion, and so on. But I want to say older people were young once, and whilst the social, economic, and cultural context has changed, there were probably many emotional and practical challenges then as now, including survival of periods of war. The definition of mental health has shifted from a diagnosis-focused model to one that emphasizes positive psychological function. Mental health is now characterized by a more holistic and positive perspective that includes well-being, recovery, social functioning, and quality of life. In other words, the language of mental health and ill health has changed. There are new diagnoses, new measurements, new ways of thinking and talking about mental health. Expectations may have changed too, with a sense of increased entitlement to be happy. But can it be assumed that our predecessors, or even those of my generation, did not experience mental health challenges? I don't think that this is so. What of the 18 and 19-year-olds whose names are inscribed in Pembroke's cloisters? They went off to the First World War and some to the Second, terrified. What of the generations who lost their parents, brothers and sisters in the wars? We might call them the silent generation, not in a traditionalist sense, but in the sense of people being ashamed of feelings. There was no language, perhaps, with no acceptance that it was okay to talk about emotions. The cultural shift in regard to mental health has been hugely important, and I welcome it. But it doesn't mean that mental health issues are worse or that today's generation face more difficulties in this sense than previous generations. The challenges are different, and there is greater easiness in talking about those challenges, but comparisons, let's call them conflicts if you like, they're not helpful. Thank you very much.
Hope that I can turn my microphone on. I was at the William Pitt Seminar last year. That today. So I'm going to. No. Can you hear me now? Okay. If I hold this up here, can you hear that? So. Mixed views, sort of. People at the very back, can you hear me if I hold this? No. All right. I mean, even as a young person, my tech abilities aren't going far enough to solve this. So we did test this before. We did test it, yes.
Well, I don't think it's the... Try that.
Is that working better? Hello? Can we hear? I don't think that's working either.
Can you just hold that?
I can. Is that better? Yes. All right. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to continue the themes that Professor Gelsthorpe, who I've cited in my essay, mentioned. I'm going to think about mental health. And mental health, it's a tricky one. It's part of the very fabric of our beings, but it's a lot like those invisible seams. So a little wear and tear from the outside, maybe you're not even going to notice it. But when those themes truly start to fray, well, then the entire fabric can start to unravel. As a global society, we really are facing this question of whether we are descending into an abyss of mental health challenges. And for today, our topic is addressing intergenerational conflict. I'd like us to explore together how we can use mental health as a critical pivot towards the promotion of intergenerational collaboration and harmony. But of course, to work out where we're going, we've got to see where we currently are. So this talk is only short. I'm going to surface scratch some broad generational divides to do with mental health, our old and our young, and I hope that we'll pick this apart together a little bit later. I'm using the Brighter Future Ahead, action report of 2022 because it's a fantastic analysis of perceptions of youth livelihoods in the 21st century, critically across 3 different generations, listening to our current youth, our current parents, and our current grandparents, so quite fitting for our theme today. And I'm about to throw some numbers at you, so I hope we can all keep up. 1 in 6 children suffer a mental health challenge between the ages of 5 to 16 in the UK at the moment. In the 2021 to 2022 period, 17 to 19-year-olds in England that were going to suffer a mental health challenge was at 25%. Between 2019 to 2022, there was a 50% increase in the risk to youth mental health challenges. 57% of our parents believe that childhoods today are worse than when they were children. The equivalent figure for grandparents is 64%. And 30% of children are deeply concerned about their families' financial situations. Lots of numbers, but when we consider what might be driving those increases in risk, there are multiple factors. I'm only going to highlight 2 for right now. The pandemic obviously takes a very dominant front seat, and its most detrimental long-term impact is the fact that it deepened existing social inequalities. Not all schools could have online classes. You had the acceleration and the progression of some students' education and the stagnation of others. We saw a global spike in domestic violence, coupled with the physical inescapability of the home environment. And have we noticed across research that one's individual or one's family profile in terms of socioeconomic status was a seriously critical factor in whether you were able to be resilient in your mental health and buffer against the challenges that you faced. The burgeoning use of social media has also caused the erosion of self-identity, this mass tendency to lead a double life, that you can airbrush your imperfections entirely out of the picture while still retaining them in your everyday life. There is the almost instantaneous transfer of information, which is both very positive. We've got long-distance communication, we have intercontinental research dissemination, and it is almost equally a very destructive force. We see acceleration of manipulation, of lies, of disinformation, and of exploitation. Now, if we turn track ever so slightly, we think about our older generations. There is now a dedicated NHS page titled Loneliness in Older Adults. Social isolation is in many ways a direct contradiction to our human evolution towards interdependence and interconnectivity. And this was a serious concern even prior to the pandemic. It has only become worse. Studies by Age UK have shown that more than 2 million people over the age of 75 in England live alone, and 1 million of those individuals can go over a month without talking to friends, family, or neighbours. Now, I don't know about you all, but I find that really unsettling as a potential trajectory, perhaps because today is all about talking. But the fact that we might be heading towards the possibility of being muted by circumstance, by the inevitability of growing older, seems unfair and it seems unnecessary. We do float society on the sea of language, both verbal and non-verbal. So when we face social isolation, particularly when our older generations face social isolation, we see a very quick spiral into severe depression, severe anxiety, and in the worst cases, there are global tendencies towards an increase in suicidal ideation and suicidal behavior, particularly in cases where social support is either absent or inaccessible. So I want to pause briefly, because I hope what you might have started to realize is that what I'm describing and what I will describe of both intergenerational conflict and mental health challenges is that it's not necessarily new, neither conceptually nor in our tangible reality. Instead, these challenges have evolved throughout our human history. They take on different faces as we grow in our capacities. The earliest reference that I've managed to find for intergenerational conflict takes us back to ancient Mesopotamia. In the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh and Akka, there is a line in which the elders and the youngest, they're in dispute over whether to go to war against the city of Kish. And the elders say, "You are young, Gilgamesh. Your enthusiasm carries you away. You do not understand what you persist in doing." And that's still a very familiar image, the idea of wiser, overbearing older generations at loggerheads with inexperienced youths. The reason that I bring this up, though, is because mental health cares very little about what your age profile is, what generation you choose to affiliate yourself with. Its effects can be felt as pervasively at 17 as at 70. And while that seems incredibly trying, that's actually going to be our point of triumph. We are connected by our ability to internalize and respond to mental health challenges. That is our opportunity within what seems so difficult. So I'd like to contextualize this in two examples. One is more anecdotal than the other. So when I was in school, this was back in 2019, so just before the pandemic, we started something called Book Buddies. And it was a literacy program, rather, where we would work with 10-year-olds, tiny humans, to improve their understanding of what's in a story. How do you tell a story? How do you understand emotion? How do you look at sentence structure and grammar? And what I didn't realize at the time until I was thinking about this seminar today is that was a Gen Z, Gen A collaboration. It was youths for youths. We were directing the program ourselves. We were thinking about what works and what doesn't. And so it was very beneficial for these humans about yay high. They learned a huge amount. Their literacy skills improved enormously. But what we noticed for us is that it had a huge impact on our self-confidence. If you think about a 10-year-old, they have a confidence that the world hasn't quite eroded yet. If you wear braces, you have to brace yourself to have that pointed out. But that confidence that they had rubbed off on us. We were facing at the time all manner of different mental health challenges of anxiety, stress, UCAS applications. And for a Thursday afternoon every week, the contours of that challenging internal mental health landscape, well, it seemed to soften ever so slightly. When we think about tackling detachment of our older populations, on this same NHS page, it says learn to love computers, which I find funny. I'm still slightly terrified of computers, and I think it's much easier said than done. But intergenerational lifelong learning, the commitment to enabling all individuals across the lifespan to pick up new skills, to pursue up-and-coming interests, that's a brilliant way to facilitate intergenerational collaboration and critically to open the floor up to intergenerational dialogue, to tolerance, and to perspective-taking. Across Europe in recent years, there's been the implementation of ICT Guides, which is a digital literacy program that is tackling social polarization that is caused by digital technologies. We often have in-groups of our youths that have grown up digitally dependent and our out-group of our older generations that have not. And this particular study that I'm referring to, that's a program where there were immigrant youths, principally from Syria and Afghanistan, that would teach older citizens across Germany, Spain, the UK, and Sweden about how to use computers, how do you log into Skype, how do you work with all of this very complex hardware. The program was a success, but that's actually not what I want to focus on. I want to focus on the qualitative review that came next. And they said to senior citizens, well, what did you actually think of that? How did it help you? And they said, well, we learned all of these tech things. It was amazing. But also, our collective mental health improved because our sense of usefulness was reinforced. We had as much to teach them that they had to teach us. We could help them with their English skills, and that's a real challenge for immigrants across Europe, is that the lack of fluency of English is a barrier in enabling them to be part of the economy. And they said as well, we taught them the importance of staying in school, of living up to your scholastic potential. And all of this tunes very nicely to a Vygotskian principle of social learning, that if we are to ever grow our knowledge bases, we must interact with knowledgeable people. And we are all knowledgeable people in our own right. We have as much to impart as we do to gain. And that's something very important to realize on the topic of intergenerational conflict, that we can get lost in our labeling, our Gen X, our Gen Z, our Gen Y. We become sort of consumed by the identity of the generational label, that we drive our in-group, out-group dichotomy so far that we can't actually see our commonalities and we can't recognize the opportunity in our own differences. But when we look at all that can be learned and we think about the bidirectionality of that learning influence, its mutual benefit, well, we might just start opening the doors that we've otherwise been holding shut. So when I started this talk, I said that mental health is the invisible seams of self, but I hope that we've started to explore that it's actually much more than that. It's also the invisible seams that bind us together as a collective. And there are solutions that exist at micro and at macro levels that will scaffold a better future for our current generations and those to come when we tune into commonalities and when we celebrate these differences. But the final thought that I'd like to end on is to say that over the course of this afternoon, we're going to be envisioning our next steps for a brighter future ahead, ! And it's very important that as a room full of different generations here today, whatever we decide those next steps to be, we must take them forward together. Thank you very much.
Well done. Thank you. So, I was just thinking back into the past, and so yes, I agree that Gen Z has it tough, of course, but I'm also thinking about the fact that they are the most knowledgeable generation we have ever had. They have access to more knowledge than we ever had, and certainly if I go back to my grandfather, who was born in 1900, and compare him to the time when I was young, and then compare now, the ability to access that knowledge. So knowledge is there. So the question with knowledge is, what do you really do with it? The other thing that I think is very important is that every generation sees further than the last. So every generation stands on the shoulders of others. And that's really important because it brings a way of imagining change. So what Gen Z really what impresses me most about the Gen Z generation is that they are the least prejudiced generation we have ever had on the planet, the least prejudiced. And that's there in everything that they think about and do. And this, I think, is a quite remarkable fact, because what it draws attention to is that the idea of generation is not something as natural as we imagine it to be. It's actually very constructed and contested. So we heard wonderful thing from Lorraine about how all these ideas of generation have worked out over time. And of course, you know, when I was at university here, we were all supposed to be fighting too much, drinking too much, taking too many drugs, and having sex too much. Nobody ever mentions that now, I notice. So no person in Gen Z ever worries about whether you're doing any of those things too much, right? That was a different kind of generational struggle. But I wonder whether we can really talk about a boomer generation at all. Because does the boomer generation exist, or rather, who does it exist for? Because nothing applies to all people. If we were all overdetermined by the circumstances of our generation, we would never do anything different. It would be an appalling situation if all we could think and do was to be defined by our times. There always have to be people who are prepared to do something different and to stand out differently, and that matters. So yesterday I was launching the Prosperity Index for East London, and this is based on work that my team have been doing. But let me just say very briefly that the difference in prosperity scores between those people who are over 60 and those people who are under 30 is about 10%. The older people are less prosperous than the young. Now, of course, this varies from place to place, but it's also a fact when you look at the data that women are much less prosperous than men. And ethnic communities are much less prosperous than pretty much everybody. So when we think about the debates that are going on around the boomer generation, they hinge, for the most part, at least in the press, not when you're talking to Gen Z themselves, they hinge on pensions and housing or mortgages. So let's just think about pensions for a moment in the UK. How well are the boomer generation doing? Well, around 2 million pensioners in the UK live in poverty. Around 3 million of them have no workplace or private pension at all. 1.3 million of them have no savings. There's more than 17 years difference in a healthy life expectancy between the most and the least affluent in that group. Now, when you retire in the UK, at retirement, only 13% of women qualify for a full state pension. And that's the lowest state pension of any OECD country. So just to remind you, for those who haven't taken your pension, that it's £221 a week. Now, the median annual wage for the United Kingdom is just under 35,000. That sum comes nowhere near it. The difference between white and black pensioners is around 24%. White pensioners are better off. The difference between a white man and a woman from any ethnic minority background, as far as pensions is concerned, is around 51%. And people from ethnic minority backgrounds are twice as likely to live in poverty across the whole of Britain. So who is a boomer? Now, let me think about my work in Africa for a second. In sub-Saharan Africa, about 22% of people across sub-Saharan Africa receive a pension. So that's only 1 in 5. In Kenya, where I've worked for 40 years or more, brought in pensions for the over 75s, which you would think of more really as social protection rather than pensions, but anyway, you get it if you're over 75. And it's 4,000 Kenyan shillings a month, so it's about £26 a month. So when we think across the world about who's done well in this generation of boomers, we must surely be thinking about a very specific group of people and not about everybody. Now, if we think about home ownership in the UK, yes, I absolutely agree, actually word for word, with everything that Diane said, but I'm coming last, so I have to say something different, okay? Now, home ownership in the UK. So if you look at the people who are between the ages of 55 and 64, 25% of them are living in rented accommodation. And under 50% of that group own their property outright. So yes, their property might be worth a lot of money, but they're probably holding quite a large debt against it. So assets have been improving and incomes have not. Now, when we think about what happens to the intra-generational difficulties, we have to come back to the whole problem, I think, of women's unpaid work. So in about 2015, the Office of National Statistics in the United Kingdom decided to do an investigation of the value of women's unpaid work, and they calculated it as around £1 trillion at the time, which they said was equivalent to 56% of GDP. Now, of course, I can't remember what GDP was in 2014, but there's a good chance that Diane can, and she'll probably tell us later roughly what that was about. But the thing that comes into this question is, what does this unpaid work mean? So it's caring, looking after people, mentoring the young, doing the housework, and so on. So the Office of National Statistics worked out, using the basic information we get from our statistical coverage, that the age group 36 to 45 do most of the stuff. The good news is, if you're over 56 years of old and you're a woman, you do most of the cooking and the laundry. And in 2023, when they looked at it again, they worked out that 2/3 of women's working hours each week are actually unpaid. Now, the value of that unpaid women's work globally is probably around 12 trillion pounds. These things are extremely difficult to calculate, so we can discuss whether or not the figure is accurate. But let me just say before we do that it's likely that the figures I've given you are an underestimate. So coming again to housing. So about the same problem with pensions, really. About 2 million older people live in homes that don't meet any basic standard of decency. And when we look around the world, we think about mortgages and indebtedness and what it means to own a home and who owns a home and how you get a home. So in Uganda, there are around 50 million people in the population. Outstanding mortgages, that is, the ones that have not been paid off, of the kind that we are used to having in the United Kingdom, currently at the moment number about 7,000. So here we have a very different situation when we look around the world. Now, one of the things that I did agree very much with Lorraine about was the question of you can't blame things on social media. When I was a student, all the ills that we were suffering from, as far as the older generation were concerned, were caused by television. Now they're all caused by social media, and none of those statements are true. But what we really don't want to do is to be driven by a kind of mad Daily Mail understanding of the world in our social media towards a sort of ageist thing where everybody's saying, oh, you know, you're a boomer and you're doing really well, and I'm in a generation that's not doing really well. And why is that important? It's important because these kind of negative tropes actually work against what we can do together. They also work against our own instincts for solidarity. Humans are deeply social people. We have problems with almost everyone we're intimate with, but we know that we love them. We want the best for them. One of the things we do in universities is we really set out to give every young person who comes to university a really good start in life. We don't start out to have a generational conflict with them. Now, one of the things that concerns me about this is if we think about social media, is who's driving this discussion? And I'm a little concerned here that actually some of the younger generation might be getting caught up in a discussion which is a little, in my view, shall we say, populist. Or rather, there's a set of elite who have a rather long-running interest in trying to direct the anger of young people away from class inequality, away from racial inequality, away from systemic injustice, to thinking it's all a problem of age. Because age is something that you can't do anything about. There's going to be generations. You all have parents. So let's blame them for everything. And then we don't have to be responsible for the systemic injustice that, you know, that devastates all of our societies. So here I think we come back to the point that Prashanti made. So if we are to be able to do anything about climate change, about any of the challenges we face, we need to collaborate. The Generation Z is the most knowledgeable generation. We need to collaborate with them. We need to share. We need to deepen our understanding of relationality. We need to get together. We need to make sure that our institutions, our universities, but also other places like trade unions and workplace-based institutions, we need to innovate those institutions and go back to them and reanimate them and make sure that we are in dialogue and discussion all the time. We need to make sure that we understand that what will prevent all of this from going as wrong as it could is social solidarity. And so we have to work towards it together. Thank you.
We're now going to have a discussion, which is why we need more than one microphone. I think everybody now has, here, I should turn mine on. Okay, now you should be able to hear me, right. I think we've all got working microphones now. So what's going to happen now is we're going to have a discussion for a bit of time, 30-ish minutes, and then we're going to break and send you out to get a drink and marshal your questions, and then we're going to come back in and have some time for the audience to ask questions of our panelists. Okay? But I'll begin, and I thought I would begin actually where we started with Diane. Diane, I think the question of whether this intergenerational conflict is in fact a robust phenomenon is one that you could probably answer because you probably have data on that. And you know, we've heard Henrietta sort of questioning whether it is a robust phenomenon, perhaps within the whole of the UK, certainly questioning whether it's broader than that. But I suspect you may know empirically and know the answer to the question of how widespread the fact that the older people have all the resources and the younger people are shorted resources. How widespread is that as a phenomenon?
Well, I'm going to start with the classic economist answer, which is it depends exactly what you want to measure. And there are different ways of trying to assess that numerically. So one example would be that it used to be the case that pensioners were the group of the population with the highest rates of poverty in the UK. That has now flipped, and it's children that are the group with the highest rates of poverty in the UK. So there's a metric. I don't have the percentages in my head, but child poverty is a significant phenomenon. But another way to think about it might be attitudes towards climate change or environmental crisis. And there too, you can see very clear differences in attitudes in different generations. So younger people are much more concerned than older people. But it is complicated because, as Henrietta was saying, this plays into other kinds of social divisions. And so young men with low educational attainment are not going to be so concerned about climate change. So it is a mixed picture. I think we're probably all agreeing that setting this up as conflict is not quite the right way to think about it. And certainly if we want to create a better world for the future, we're going to need the kind of cooperation that everybody's been talking about today.
Okay, thank you. So Henrietta, you said you agreed with everything Diane said. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, I think it's always wise to agree with Diane, so I do. You know, she made a very compelling case, and so we know from other data that what's been happening over time is that if you have capital assets and if you're living from capital assets, then you're doing rather better than people who try to live by earning a lot of money, especially under certain circumstances. It's very difficult to earn enough to do as well as those who already have capital assets, and so we've been discussing that for some time. But I think the difficulty here is that we need to just be aware that, as Diane has just said, that it's a very complex picture, that it really matters where you are and who you are. So people generally in, you know, the southeast of the country are better off than those in the northeast. We have families in the northeast of the country who haven't worked in 3 generations. And that is a very specific kind of problem. And we also now have people who are in the working age for the population and who are not working and not seeking work. And that means that we have huge wastage. We are wasting our human capital, right? We are not allowing everybody to fulfill their full potential. And not all of those people are young people. Many of them are actually middle-aged people. And so we need to attend to the specific circumstances that people find themselves in. And I think that it's better if we think about how we address the sort of intersecting problems we have in society, all of us, rather than imagining that we're somehow in conflict with each other.
Thank you. So Lorraine, I think I heard in your thinking reference to conflict in the psychological sense, enduring conflict. There's always been conflict between the generations, and you know, there's obviously that goes back to psychological theories about why that would be. We've got, you know, a number of people on the panel wanting to de-emphasize conflict. I wonder if you would want to speak to what the role of that underlying conflict is, and how much attention we should give it, or is it perhaps something that just something that opens up under these conditions of resource stress that is not terribly helpful when it comes to solutions?
I think the underlying process of conflict is really to do with growing up.
I'm sure people can hear you. Are you on?
I am on. Can you hear me?
You just hold it next to your mouth.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? Is that better?
Better, yes.
Thank you. So I think the underlying process of conflict, if we want to use that word, and I'm not entirely sure that it's helpful to use the word conflict, I think it's to do with growing up. Many young people commit crime, in inverted commas, because of course the very concept and definition of crime changes over time, as we've seen. But most young people grow out of it. By the age of 23, young women, about 25 for young men. A very small percentage of those young people who commit crime will persist. So about 5% of those who persist are responsible for 95% of the crime. So we might say that whether youth culture, youth crime, it's a process of testing boundaries. And I have used the notion of youth crime being a metaphor for social change, and there being fear of that social change, to emphasize really that people are testing boundaries, challenging the family, challenging social institutions, challenging cultural norms. And most of us engage in that in one way or another, and then we survive and gradually join the majorities, in the plural, in accepting the norms, or at least changing them along the way.
So that's interesting. I think, Prashanti, you had the example of how empowering it was for young people to help younger people. And I wonder if, and then you really emphasized the need for intergenerational collaboration. But I'm wondering if some of the work that needs to be done is about empowering young people. I mean, if in fact, as Lorraine is saying, this is in some sense one strand of this is just about growing up and the form that takes right now, and if in fact there's work to be done for young people, with young people, just becoming more agentic, more effective, and more empowered.
I think absolutely. I think the thing is that it's written in history, in lots of different stories, that young people are chronically inexperienced, but that we all grow up and then we become very experienced. And I think our young generation at the moment, as Professor Moore said, we have a lot to offer in terms of our understanding of digital literacy, in terms of our perspective is valuable. But I think the way society seems to have been built at the moment is that we're too immature for that perspective to ever come through. So it's important that actually we reinvest in our youth. And if you look at the Labour manifesto, there is now a section that says we want to focus on empowering young people, we want to listen to their voices. The thing that will be really interesting to see is whether that comes to light, because all the right words are there. And I think we absolutely, as you've said, we have a lot to offer, and it's about making sure that on important decisions, on topics of intergenerational conflict, all the voices are represented at that table. And I think our young people very much need to be represented too.
So you mentioned universities.
Yes.
We're sitting in one. I'd like to hear actually from each of our panelists what role you think universities have in fostering more positive conditions. I'm avoiding, as you can hear, the conflict, the C word, but fostering more positive, in changing the narrative, shall we say, right? Because the intergenerational conflict is a narrative. I hear everybody on the panel agreeing with it in part and wanting to challenge it in part. What role can universities play in creating new narratives and perhaps helping with the underlying conditions too? And I'll start down here with Henrietta.
Well, I think I said a little bit about that when I was talking. I think that one of the things that universities do is to try to give all young people the best possible start in life, but that's only the people they have under their hand. The question is what happens to everyone who's not in a university. And so one of the things that we've been doing in the Institute is we've been developing what we call citizen scientists. So all of my research teams, wherever they work in the world, they have ordinary citizens who are trained to work on the research team. We train them formally. And many of them are young people, most of them in fact. And we've now persuaded University College London to accredit these young people. So this is a very, very significant process that a university has gone through. And it means a university making a serious commitment to the well-being of all kinds of young people outside the normal way in which a university works. And it means that I was speaking yesterday at the event I mentioned, launching the Prosperity Index in East London, and we have at least one young woman who started working for us when she left school, so she was around 18. She's now 22, and she's already now a counsellor. So the effect of working alongside the research team has been enormously empowering. And that's what a university can do, because a university encourages you to inquire, as my other university used to say, into the causes of things. And so consequently, I think that that is an empowering move for everybody, really.
Thank you. Lorraine.
Yes, what a good question. I think that universities, or this university, can engage in intergenerational learning more. In criminology, we certainly try and do that, whether it's talking with and involving people in research, people with lived experience of the criminal justice system, or indeed training young people who have been subject to the criminal justice system to engage in participatory research. So we too are looking at accreditation of skills for those young people, so that we don't do things to people, we do things with people. At the other end of the scale, I think we can learn a lot from people who have experience in the world of crime and criminal justice, by engaging them and involving students, talking with them, learning from them. And I hope that there'll be opportunity to come back to something that Prashanti said about collaboration in relation to mental health, because I want to say something there. I've started running a lifelong learning class and in Ely on crime and justice, and I can tell you that I think that the questions that came from the group, a very mixed group of people, different ages, the questions that have come are really searching and important questions. It's been a hugely important experience. And at the end of the course, people have said, oh, well, I'm changing my mind about crime and punishment. I can see that we need fewer people in prison. And I have reflected, well, if only I had done this earlier in my career and gone into prisons or wherever that might have been helpful, probably more impactful than 100, 200 academic papers.
Thank you. Diane.
I've only been in a university for 10 years, and the thing that really strikes me is that it's a place where old people like me meet a lot of young people. And sometimes you really think that, oh my goodness, when you hear what they have to say. Sometimes it's the realization that for the students, the financial crisis is ancient history, and they are open-mouthed when they hear that I used to have to do my homework by candlelight because of the strikes in the 1970s. So it's a place where those encounters take place. I'm really keen, as you know, on the concept of a civic university, as we call it now, how universities engage with their localities and become engines not only of economic growth, but social cohesion and prosperity more broadly defined for their area. And that means engaging with local schools and colleges, thinking about apprenticeships being set up for local young people, thinking about relations with local employers and civil society as well. So I think that there are good foundations to build on, but there's a lot more that could be done in casting the net wider so that we meet different kinds of young people and have those interesting encounters that we get day to day in universities.
Indeed. Prashanti, what can universities do?
So I think I echo all of the views that have been said so far. I think it's a fantastic question. What I would like to do is I'd like to think about this university for the moment. So we have enormous privilege to be in this room right now. And I remember I graduated in June, and in July I had someone ask me if I'd set up my Cantab email. And I said, no, I have a Gmail account. Why does that why does that matter? And she said, because people are going to listen when you send an email and it says prashanti.sen@cantab.ac.uk. This is an institution that has enormous power to elevate the voices of those around them. And I know there are some students at the back that are already working on this and working on community initiatives. I'd say principally, it's important that all of our colleges at Cambridge really support those types of initiatives and see just how much power you have to be heard, and the platform that you bring to have all of those voices that maybe don't have opportunity to be heard, to bring them to the table. The other thing that I would say is there's a huge amount of research that gets pumped out of institutions such as Cambridge, institutions such as UCL and Imperial. Academic research can be incredibly inaccessible, even though it's saying really, really important things. And so it's also important that we take on the responsibility to make that research accessible beyond the academic sphere.
Thank you. Lorraine, you asked to come back to mental health.
Oh, I did. Just, I wanted to pick up on Prashanti's important point about collaboration, and perhaps collaboration in changing the culture, because I think that young people are much more used to talking about mental health and recognizing its importance, and that it's important to talk about feelings and so on. I very much regret that I didn't talk to my father, grandfather about their war experiences. My aunt, who was an evacuee, sent to the other end of the country for 3 years, and I didn't talk to my aunt, my German aunt in Cottbus, East Germany, who lived under Stasi rule, essentially. I didn't talk to them, didn't ask them questions until their dying days. But I learned so much. And reflecting on it further, I think that young people who are more articulate and more confident, some, of course, in talking about mental health, could perhaps share that confidence with older people who are not used to talking about such things. So collaboration in that sense.
Okay, thank you. Finally, and this is also going to be a question to to each member of the panel. We're 100 days into a new Labour government. We can't very well leave this stage without thinking a bit about what they should be doing to address the issues that we're talking about, what they can and should be doing to address these issues, and in terms of both where resources should be directed, how politics should be managed, I mean, you name it. My question to each of you is what would you like to see? What's one thing? Let's restrict it to one thing. What's the most important thing that our new government can do to help solve these issues? And I'll start with Diane, because you're next to Lorraine, and I know you've given this some thought.
Well, for me, it won't be a surprise to anybody here, it's investing. And there's a lot of debate about the headroom and how much money is available to invest, which is entirely the wrong way to think about it. Because if projects are good projects that create economic value and generate a return, how you finance that is the secondary question. And I think, although projects will vary in their success rates and how much they do return, there's an awful lot of need. So investing in the infrastructure, investing in housing, investing in education, because spending per pupil in this country above primary level has been going down for over a decade. We're not investing in human capital, which is the key driver of long-term economic growth. So investing is my answer.
Okay. Prashanti?
I would say build up trust. So we exist in a democracy, and of course democracy is the voices of the people who vote. And we know that there is a big gap in young people not voting. And when you look at some of the psychology behind that, is because there is a huge amount of distrust in political authority. Now, Labour, as its sort of government profile, is very much community-focused, people-focused. And as I mentioned, the Labour manifesto, there are all of the words there, the positive words to set up better political trust, and it's important that those are reinforced with actual action that will bring young people's votes into the fore and therefore enhance our political and social landscape.
Thank you. Lorraine.
Investment in young people, young people who have perhaps very different needs, invest in spaces and places for people, young people to do their growing up. I would go so far as to say decriminalise youth crime at least, if not the whole criminal justice system, but perhaps that's too provocative. I think it's too important for politicians to deal with. But we have the lowest age of criminal responsibility across Europe, and indeed elsewhere, age 10. We draw young people into the criminal justice system, we label them, and then they cannot escape those labels. They cannot escape the deleterious impact of the label. Other countries manage to do it, to decriminalize young people's activities, their crime. It doesn't mean that nothing happens. It just means they're not drawn into the criminal justice system. So other kinds of social services would be more constructive and more helpful.
Thank you. Henrietta.
Well, I pretty much agree with what others have said, but I think the most important thing is to focus on improving the quality of people's lives, because the quality of people's lives is pretty dire. And I think the way to do that is to actually think hard about how to link improvements in people's quality of life to improvements in productivity. Because we do need to do more with the wealth we create, and we do need to create more of that wealth. But the question of what we do with it is important, because if all we do with it is extract it and put it into certain people's pockets, it's not going to do much good for all of us. What we do need to do is to invest it in our public services, because, you know, when you are just an ordinary citizen of the United Kingdom or an ordinary resident, you can't do much about the fact that air pollution is so bad that we have carbon in the bodies of unborn children. You can't do much about the fact that less than 10% of our rivers meet the required standard. You can't do anything about the fact that most of our beaches are unswimmable. The state of the nation requires serious action. And I think we do need to make that investment in public services. But so we have to stop this argument, as Diane has just said, about saying there is no money. So, because we have to think differently about what the economy does for us rather than what we do for the economy.
Okay, thank you. Let's give our panelists a round of applause for that. Okay, so now we're going to have a break. We're going to go out, have a cup of tea or something out there. I don't know quite what's out there, but whatever it is, we'll drink it. And then we're going to come back in and give you all an opportunity to ask questions of our panelists, okay? So it'll be a short break, and then we'll bring you all back in for the audience question and answer. Thank you.
Test. Test, test.
Checking.
And if you do one side. I think that might be better. If you can try and hold it at sort of like that distance. Sorry. I know we tried to set this up, but it didn't work.
Okay, let's reconvene. So we have, I hope, some questions from the audience. And we've got 2 mic runners, one here and one unidentified. Here. Ah, there you are. Okay, thank you. Please raise your hands and I will call on you. Yes.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
First, that was remarkable. I thought it was really fantastic, and everyone was tremendous. It has made me rethink myself. I'm a 58-year-old baby brother who is also a grandfather and a father. In the last 3 months, 2 members of my extended family who are at retirement age have, I'm pretty sure, been radicalized through social media to the far right, and it's been horrifying. But a 21-year-old member of our family who produces video essays on YouTube has been trying his best to educate them. I'm a corporate fellow, so I was here last year, and I'll just keep this brief, where our theme was aging. And the rapidly changing demographic picture, where Global South has a massively different demographic picture to the privileged Northwest, and where we were being told, locally and globally, we need to make changes far more rapidly than our current political system allows us to. And I just think it has to happen fast. So what's the secret to making change happen fast, is my question.
Oh, gosh, that's a big question. I think about it in two ways. One is that as individuals, as people who've got the wealth of Cambridge research or others in other universities, then it's our responsibility as academics to engage with those debates if we're doing something that has policy implications. And so in my institute, the Bennett Institute, we do an awful lot of that, and many other academics also. There's a second channel, which is about how does the climate of ideas get shaped? And that, I think, is much harder, because as you allude to, social media is now making that very complicated. There are bad actors. It calls to my mind sometimes the struggle for ideas in the immediate post-war years, when the Cold War was heating up, and Western countries put a lot of resource into generating ideas. Now, that's been controversial in retrospect, but maybe that's something that is worth thinking about now. So social media complicates it, but in any case, the second part of our challenge as academics is to think about what is the worldview that our ideas are contributing to, and how can that bring about change? Because change is usually slow and difficult, and then sometimes it's really quick.
I might just actually add to that. And can everybody hear me? I've been told about my mic. Okay. So you mentioned radicalization, you mentioned social media. So at the moment, we are seeing a really rapid increase in disinformation across social media. And at Cambridge, under the Professor van der Linden and Professor Rosenbeek, their lab is entirely dedicated to stopping disinformation and to educating about disinformation. So I think actually if you want to think about accelerating change, you've got to think about what's the information that's going out at the moment, how can we ensure that that is accurate, that's representative of the actual socio-political and cultural landscape. And once you've set that as a good foundation, once you've actually built the trust within people and you've sort of dismantled this echo chamber ideology, I think you'll find that change might speed up, but it's not going to happen immediately until we sort out all of these tectonic frictions.
Well, I think this is a big question, but one element of it is the fact that if we're talking about climate change, for example, we also have to acknowledge that there's been a massive capture of government and lobbying of government by those who have financial interests in maintaining the fossil fuel industry. And for a long time when we were saying these kinds of things, people just said, oh, well, academics are, buying into conspiracy theories, et cetera, et cetera. But the evidence now, for example, for what, ExxonMobil was up to and many other companies is very good, and they've done the work and they've released the data on what these people were doing. And that process is still going on. So one of the things that happens is that a conversation grows. So, for example, with the invasion of Ukraine, a conversation has grown about frailty in the energy systems and supplies chains for Europe. And that's putting huge pressure on governments from various actors within the space, saying, okay, you do need to open up new oil fields in the North Sea, because if you don't, there's not going to be any solution for security, et cetera, okay? Now, actually, so we need to push back not just on the level of the people you get on social media who think that, American presidents are descended from a race of lizards, which is a serious problem and needs to be addressed. But you also need to push back against what looks like a kind of rational form of argumentation, which is laying out a world which you find very difficult to challenge, because, you very well know in your working life, you may know a great deal about this, but for other people, they think, I don't want to be in the dark during the winter. This is obviously something we need to do. So what needs to happen is a bigger public debate around those issues, where senior academics have actually a very big role to play. And they need to play that role in facing the public in different dimensions, but they also need to do it in conversation, as many indeed do, with civil servants, because this is enormously important in shaping the way that those arguments go on inside departments and ministries.
Can I just shout?
Well, no, we'll give you a microphone. No.
I think my point is, taking Prashanti as an unrepresentative example, but not that unrepresentative, we need to find urgent ways of listening and trusting and collaborating with the people who really know and care. Yeah. And that's Prashanti's generation, honestly. Yeah. And they are reaching audiences, my YouTuber, that an academic, a seniorish, aging academic, dreams of reaching. And he's getting comments from all over the world, positive comments. He's doing what he... But that's a cultural thing. But we hosted a number of conferences here on environmental themes, and Tony Juniper came and spoke at the one on chalk streams last year. And he talked in his remarks about, everyone knows about NIMBYism, not in my backyardism, as an obstacle to rapid change. He said a much more cogent threat to that was NIMTOism, not in my term of office-ism. So it's the electoral cycle dominated by the kind of short-termism which stops us confronting the kinds of issues that are looming and fast. The inundation map, in terms of Cambridgeshire and Essex, puts our house 8 miles away from Cambridge in a Cambridgeshire village as the last street in that village not flooded by 2050. Sure. So it's happening fast. So the language to agitate, to animate urgent change, and forms of discourse and dialogue and collaboration to animate urgent change, that's what I was trying to get at, I suppose. Sorry, I'll shut up.
I know there's another question about the demographic transition. I'm not sure where that question is. I can't. I'm blinded. Oh, there you are. Let's go over here.
Thank you. Yes, David Cope from Clare Hall. Yes, I really think that we cannot get to grips with this subject without paying attention to the demographics and the demographic change which is occurring, and in the proportions of the population living in different age groups. And it's inevitable, maybe I won't even say unavoidable, that there's going to be an increase in the proportion of people like me, some of the older groups. Though the decline in the birth rate will probably even out, it can't really go much lower, there will be a decline in the proportion of the younger generations. And the implications of that really, I think, do need to be looked at extremely carefully. It's also true internationally, but let's focus perhaps on the UK. Thank you.
Okay, does somebody on the panel want to take on the impact on the phenomena we're talking about of the declining birth rates?
Well, I think the demography angle is an extremely important one. I mean, the fastest growing continent in the world at the moment is Africa. And, you know, you have strong informalization in the economy, so there is no way those economies can absorb the number of young people who need to enter or are entering at a moment when they could be in the workplace. The question of what the plan is under those economic models is very difficult. We're getting increasing informalization in the economy here, and the plan here for what the economy is going to do is also rather weak. It tends to be a plan that's based on, well, if we could get everybody into the labor market. So that's tricky in itself, and it very much connects to the idea of intergenerational conflict, because what a lot of very highly qualified young people are complaining about is that they can't find the job they want. And I think part of that is to do with the fact that we need to create the next phase of jobs. We haven't actually created them. There's a lot of chat about green transition jobs and this kind of job and that job. We actually haven't created any of these jobs yet. What we have tried to do, and universities need to be a little bit careful in this because their high-end research also underpins some of this, is that there's a great tendency to say, yes, well, we need to be in the forefront of AI or carbon capture or something. So we're going to go and put this factory or whatever it is, facility, in Wales, where Wales needs employment. But when the fact of the matter is that none of the people who live in that area are ever going to be employed in that facility. There's no capacity. First of all, you don't need very many people, and the skills base is not appropriate. So there's lots and lots of things that Diane could talk about that need to be dealt with there, but there needs to be a new way of managing the labour market, and we haven't worked out what that is, and we haven't worked out what the next set of jobs is. But there is also a problem about the fact that the pension systems that we have and the power that the pension investment people have is something that's itself going to undergo a little bit of a sea change, I think, because the idea of when we brought in pensions originally for people, nobody really envisaged you living very long after you finally finished working. The problem now is, you know, if I am extraordinarily lucky, I might live into my 90s, right? Prashanti and her team are going to live into their hundreds. So the question then is, you know, what do you do with the retirement age at 67 when you live to 100 and you don't have a lot of workers? So you're going to have to change the pension system, and there will be massive difficulty around changing the pension system. But it was for a time when I think the world was a very different place. But Diane will have views on this, so perhaps I'll hand over to her at this moment.
Thank you. I think we're going to have to work longer. That's pretty clear. And I would agree with the philosophy of the question, which is that we haven't been paying enough attention to the implications of demography, which are long-term. I mean, of course, we have migration. Many economists think migration is welcome. The people who are not claiming asylum, so legal migrants, tend to be highly skilled people who've got skills that are not largely present in the countries they go to. So it's a positive thing economically. I'd also add that birth rates can change. Baby boom took everybody by surprise. And maybe another place to look is what are the facilities and conditions that make it appealing or not to have children. And it's difficult enough getting your kid into a nursery, even with the current very low rate, lower than replacement birth rate. So we could look at some things like that as well.
I would actually just like to pick up on something in that. So when we think about birth rates, we're obviously thinking about the family, and the family is a very important unit of society. So this is a slightly different approach, but there is a model in psychology that is one of the most robust for thinking about the family. It's called the family stress model, and it's an economic psychology module that basically says that if you have adverse economic conditions, that's going to affect your parental well-being. That's going to affect your interparental dynamics and interparental conflict, and that is a mediator for the manifestation of child development problems across two different domains. So we have internalizing problems, so that's your mental health, your depression, anxiety, OCD, and your externalizing problems, which are your antisocial behaviors, your conduct disorder problems. Within that model, you can see that there are also intergenerational transmission of effects. So when we think about families, when we think about birth rates, we've also got to make sure that we are going to support those families to ensure that adverse outcomes do not manifest in the way that they currently are. And we've seen under the Tory government some implementation of programs that can support the families. There's the neonatal parental leave policy and the reducing parental conflict programs. One of the reasons why neither of those have had the success that the literature might predict them to have is because both of those programs are inaccessible as well. So if we're thinking about birth rates, we're thinking about young families, we've got to make sure that we pay attention to the research, we make the resources accessible, and we provide families with the right environment upon which they can grow.
Can I just add, I think that we need to think much more about the social origins of depression, because where there is cultural depression, the birth rate goes down. And with others, I very much think that we need investment in preschool opportunities, but also more flexible working, which, you know, in the university there is flexible working, but in many other organizations and parts of industry, there isn't that flexibility. So it's a disincentive. And of course, many people are struggling to bring up children on benefits because they're very low.
Yeah, thank you. Chris.
I wanted to follow up on Mark's question, actually, and picking up on Prashanti's point right at the end of the first half, where you said that it was rebuilding trust in democratic systems that was needed. We all know that young people communicate far more widely now than any of us ever did when we were your age. But how do we get young people more engaged with traditional political mechanisms? The most obvious example is the Brexit referendum. We all know that young people voted Remain and old people voted Leave. The percentage of people under the age of 25 who voted was 60%. That was still more than normally take part in a general election, but it was 60%. The percentage of over 65s who voted was 90%. How can we get 90% of young people participating in democratic systems? Because that could solve an awful lot of problems.
So a very big question, but a very important question as well. I think I'm a really big fan of education, as you can tell. That's what I study now, and I do think it's a really good solution for lots of the challenges that we're facing. When we look at the secondary school education curriculums, many of you will have had PSHCE, or sometimes it's called PSHE. That is a class that when I was at school, if you can imagine paper aeroplanes flying around the room as teachers stand and try and get people's attention, that's what happened. It was DOSing. It was learning to sleep with your eyes open. But there was one moment where our teacher said, "What do you want this class to be about?" And suddenly everyone was awake. And someone said, "Well, I'd like to know about voting." Now, schools, of course, can't get political in that sense, but they wanted to understand the structure of voting. What does it mean to have the right to vote? And it's a very traditional part of society, as you mentioned, but it's one that we don't feel we truly understand, because it seems that there's this favouring of the political sphere towards our older generations. So I think we can rework our education systems to explain the importance of voting from an early age, explaining also the importance of your own voice and how that can be a catalyst for change. I think that's at least one solution that immediately came to mind when you asked that question. There will be others, but that's the one that I think could actually have the most immediate effect as well.
Okay, Lorraine.
Yes, very, very much agree with that, because I think education is so important, and I'll come back to criminal justice and education in a moment. But I think what Prashanti has made me think about is locating the energy for social change, starting locally and getting people involved in things locally. So, for example, in Cambridge carbon footprint is a psychological movement, in a way, to get people to think more about the environment and to convince people that they can do something, even if it's only putting polythene on their single thickness windows, and some, if people can't afford double glazed windows. So the idea is to make every action count, and there are neighbourhood movements across Cambridge doing precisely this sort of thing. There's a brilliant book by Charles Eliot called Locating the Energy for Social Change, and I think his focus is on environmental change as it happens, but one of his key messages is appreciative inquiry, not for academics to go and work with public institutions and say, well, you've got it all wrong, you need to do A, B, and C, but rather to take an appreciative inquiry stance and to recognize the constraints on what the public institutions have done, but to assist, to help, not to lambast. very often that has happened in terms of research, academic research. We produce reports and then say, well, the criminal justice system is terrible. Well, that's of no help, really, to governments. We need to make positive suggestions. If I may come back to the original question about radicalization, I mean, I'm sure that many of us here are aware of events during the summer with the murder of 3 little girls in Southport, and then the reaction across the country with hate crime, so on and so forth. Now, I'm quite sure that many of us would want to be protected from some of the people who set fire to the hotels where asylum seekers and other migrants were living. But there were many people who threatened to do things, online hate crime and so on. I think my point is, what purpose is served by sending people to prison? Nothing will happen. Prison conditions at the moment are that people will be banged up 22 hours a day, so people will be released from prison with the same horrible attitudes that they had when they went into prison. So I think that community sentences, rehabilitation and educational programs, and if I had my way, I would have those who ransacked the hotels and other premises and chased people, threatened them, I would have them doing unpaid work to put right the damage done, but then also to meet in a controlled situation, to meet some of the asylum seekers, to be helped to recognize that they're human beings. So education is key.
Thank you. So my question is in a slightly different direction, but I just wondered, listening to your presentations earlier, when any label comes out and generations are not a different one, it's usually preceding an argument of the us versus them sort. Otherwise, we don't really need to label ourselves one way or the other. And that divide usually, I'm sorry, generalizing again, comes from the fact that we do not have enough of opportunities to contrast our view with the view of other people, as Lorraine just was talking about. And my question is our society evolving to have less willingness or maybe even less opportunities for different generations to spend time together, to find there's something to learn from one another? So just as an illustration, I grew up in a multi-generational home. My daughter lives 2,000 miles from many of her grandparents, and most of the time doesn't see a reason to even reach for the phone, because all of the information, as we started, is at her fingertips. Is the society just stopping us from talking?
I think actually this is a very good link to what Professor Gelsthorpe said before about language and about the idea of conflict. So language in society, as I think we've all mentioned, is a really, really rich medium, and it dictates a lot of our perspectives. When we talk about intergenerational conflict, the word conflict, there are always two sides, and they're always against each other. That's the nature of the word. So the more we use that type of really negative language that is politically effective, the politicians are brilliant at the psychology of language. They employ people who are very good at the psychology of language, because negative emotions are more likely to trigger action than positive emotions, which is why at the moment when we talk about conflict, we talk about divides. Just as you said, if we keep going that way, no, there will not be an opportunity to actually collaborate and to build bridges, because the medium that we're using is simply not going to permit that to come into effect. But I think if we start to change the language, and I don't mean change superficially and then do absolutely nothing in terms of action, but if we change it and we become more accommodating, then I think you will find that there is the opportunity. There's also the willingness and the tolerance to sit in conversation with individuals who are different, and to not only just have them there and to hear their voices, but to listen to what they have to say too.
Household sizes have certainly been shrinking in this country, which speaks to your argument. And there will be many contributing factors to that. One of, though, I think, is the way the employment market has evolved, that people who want to get on tend to have to move to a big city, often London or, you know, the southeast, to be able to work, and that splits up families. So part of the challenge, and only one part, is figuring out how different kinds of places can thrive and create jobs so that there's a choice to leave and there's a choice to stay.
Forgive me, I only caught part of the question, but it made me think about Robert Putnam's work, Bowling Alone, where he's talking about the decline of civic society. Here we are in what used to be a church. I'm thinking of the different places where old and young might meet quite naturally, and I think that those contexts have changed over time. Actually, I think the university community volunteer group do visit or people's homes, care homes, so on and so forth, trying to bridge the divide. But I certainly think we need to think about different ways of cementing civic society so that there can be natural meetings between young and old.
Yes, I think that's very important. And one of the great problems here is the decline of intergenerational solidarity in the workplace. So if you have a trade union, I mean, if you were young and you went to work in say, a factory for the sake of argument, you would have learned a lot of things. You would have learned, first of all, what it was to make a political argument, what it was to have a politics, what it was to be in conversation with people, what it was to think about, you know, what is just, what is fair, what should you have this wage, you have different wage. You learn all kinds of things by being in that workplace. So now we have again, and I think that it is very, very, very serious what's happening with employment, and I think that we need to think very much harder than this than we do, because we talk very glibly about the changing nature of work and very glibly about Uber and, you know, so on. But the reality of it is that people are, in their work life, much more fragmented than they would have been in the past, and that's very difficult. You know, plenty of families that I work with across the UK, you have two adults in that family. They're both employed. They both have more than one job, and they still can't feed their children. So work itself is becoming something which, you know, where the rewards for work are very problematic. But you're also not getting the kind of support in the workplace which you would have got outside the family. And that applies to lots of institutions which we've let fall into disrepute because we don't, and disuse because we claim we can't afford them. So youth clubs or, you know, other kinds of social spaces, exactly as Lorraine is saying, which maintain civic society. The good news is that actually the public are getting on with this and they need to need a bit more help. So, for example, there are all around the country people setting up things called people's supermarkets to try to bring, you know, food into what are food deserts. There are people doing stuff to, you know, cultivate areas of land. Indeed, in Cambridge itself, there's a rather good urban gardening initiative which supplies organic food to Cambridge and to care homes and so on in Cambridge. So there are lots of things that are going on in local communities which are trying to recreate that space. And actually one of the things we could very helpfully do is to support those kinds of initiatives.
Okay, so I'm going to look toward the back just because okay, I'll take,
yeah. Right at the back. There's a hand right at the back.
Can't see.
Peter Matthews, a past Pitt Fellow. One of the areas that causes a lot of trouble with intergenerational conflict is hearing. And when I talk to my granddaughters, and I say, pardon, they say, go and get your ears tested, Grandpa. And in that context, I'm afraid that we didn't catch all of the words that you said, so forgive me if I repeat something that you said and we missed. And I'm glad that the speakers refer to collaboration. When I saw the title, Intergenerational Conflict, I thought, yeah, well, what about collaboration? And I think that we ought to give credit for the collaboration that goes on in families and indeed find ways of encouraging that. And within that, there's a whole range of issues about intergenerational economics. And some of you know me. I mean, I've worked hard all my life, and we've got some savings. It's all taxed income, and we would like to be able to share that with our granddaughters. We're already doing that with their education. We would like to help them in buying their homes and so on. And that's considered now to be a bit of a tax dodge. And if you read what's going on in terms of the budget, the 7-year gap in terms of making a gift and then surviving is going to be closed. So I would like to ask the panel, what changes do you think could be made to the tax system to help family wealth passed on from generation to generation in a meaningful way? I mean, well, I understand why there's inheritance tax, but if there was greater purpose in the way in which the money is gifted, then that would certainly help. I mean, we know that there are lifetime ISAs, for example, which have got benefits because they're used to buy homes for the first time. And I wonder whether the taxation system could be reformed to deal with some of these intergenerational issues. How can I help my granddaughters without being seen to be a tax dodger and clobbered big time when it comes to settling up?
Should I start on that? Whenever there's polling about how people feel about taxes, and of course none of them are popular, but inheritance tax is by a long way the least popular. And we'll see whether the Chancellor decides to do anything about it or not in the budget. But so far, whenever it's been floated, whoever was thinking about it has stepped back from that because it's very unpopular. But the best way to make the tax system fairer is to make it more progressive. It has become, on the whole, less progressive over time. But if you want to raise taxes to spend on the investment that we all think that we want, then using rates of VAT on luxury goods, buying SUVs or fancy watches, for example, or income tax, making that more progressive. That's then neutral as to the generation and a fair system of raising the money that the country needs to provide public services and infrastructure. So that's what I would be advising the Chancellor, if she's listening.
Okay. Do another one back there. Raise your hand high, person back there with the glasses. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, there we go.
Hi. I'd like to go in a slightly different direction, if that's okay. I think it was mentioned earlier how things that are often associated with being a teenager and being youthful are taking lots of drugs, having a lot of sex, going out a lot. I think it was also mentioned earlier that those things are things that our generation aren't doing as much anymore. I'm trying to figure out how to word this in the best way. And this is like to the whole panel. Do you think that that's something that just changes along with, like, say, fashion trends or vernacular, or just like natural changes that come with a generation? Or do you think that's more of a problem, like mental health, like social media? And do you think that's something that is going to have to change or should change necessarily? Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I think when I was, thank you for that question. I think when I was talking, what I was trying to say is that there are ways of characterizing generations which are not necessarily very accurate. I don't think that in my generation we were doing a lot of fighting and drinking, as I recall, but certainly people said we were. And I think the problem with this generation is people are saying a lot of things about this generation which I very much doubt that they're actually doing. And although some of those things do happen, and Lorraine will come in here with some deep facts rather than me reflecting on these things, I think one of the things we have to recognize is that a sort of, shall we say, a fashionable way of understanding the world can take hold at particular historical moments. It doesn't necessarily mean it's wholly accurate. And part of what I was trying to do in my talk was to say, okay, let's imagine that actually There isn't this great division between generations. And I don't believe that we in any generation are wholly determined by our historical circumstances, because if we were, nothing could change. So sociologically, we can't imagine that. So I think that probably what is to be hoped is that there are trends that are developing within the current generation, but there will also be many people who are not following those trends, who are doing other things, more innovative things, more interesting things. And that it would be very unwise, as Lorraine says, to imagine that generations are characterized by something that's happening at a particular moment. So she made this point very well, actually. And it was Mrs. Thatcher who at one time set up a drugs czar because some academic information had come about which said that that in the people who were 16, something like 90% of them had tried cocaine and something else and something else. What they failed to tell the drugs czar was that by the age of 23, of those 90% who tried the drugs, something like 97% had stopped taking drugs. So this was only a moment, right? A moment. So and lots of that happened. And I think that the idea that your generation is entirely driven by social media seems to me to be possibly wildly inaccurate, because you're clearly able to critique it and understand the process and so on. So I think, just as this speaker here said with regard to your young family member who's making these critical things on YouTube. So, you know, I think we have to be careful about the way we talk about these things.
Well, I absolutely agree. There are many myths, muddles, and misconceptions about youth cultures, youth crime, so on and so forth. So never believe newspaper headlines and so on.
I think I'd just like to follow up on that, is that both Prof. Moore and Prof. Gelsel mentioned characterizations. And it is true that actually when we think about how we store information, stereotypes are classed under what we call schematic patterns. There is simply too much information out there in the world for us to think of each individual piece of information and to analyze it. So we create something called schematic representations that put together a huge amount of information and store it in our brains under labels. So I think what's really important, just as has been said, and I guess I'm just putting a technical name to this now, but we need to really critique our own schema, and we need to be aware of it, and we need to think about if we are applying a label to a particular situation or a particular group of people, more importantly, and this goes beyond generations, is that a true depiction of the majority? Is that a focus actually on something that we just think is really interesting that's come up in the news, such as that all young people are absolutely brilliant about social media and we spend our lives attached to our phones and every individual has nomophobia? That's not true, but it's scientifically interesting. It would make a good headline, and then that's absorbed into the schema, and then that's inaccurate as well. So I think, I don't know who said at the back, but in terms of generations, I think the fact that we're actually thinking about, is this an accurate pattern, bodes really well for our futures to actually dismantle some of those schema and think about creating more accurate perceptions of generations.
Okay. Now nobody in the front is raising their hands because they've been discriminated against. You've had your hand up all.
So many of you sort of started off by discussing, I guess, the timelessness of moral misgivings around younger generations. And I suppose maybe that hasn't changed so much over time. But it strikes me that something which has is that material standards of living have really improved. And, you know, there's sort of a strand of moral thought that, you know, goes all the way back to the classics, and it was contended sort of in the political economy of the Enlightenment about the moral implications of material wealth. And I'm wondering what you each think the role of that is in the contemporary moment.
So that's true up to about 10 or 12 years ago in this country. Material living standards are not increasing at the moment, and that may be contributing to the political moment that we're in. A lot of my work is trying to think about how to actually measure living standards or prosperity better than we do. And so I would argue to you that what looked like big improvements in material living standards, and are certainly big advances in different kinds of technology, including medical technologies, there have been big declines in other aspects of living standards that we just don't factor very much into our thinking. And a lot of people now, as Henrietta said, are unable to feed their children, which is not a sign of material well-being.
And I think the one aspect of livelihoods that's very, very important at the moment is that a lot of people feel that their livelihoods are deeply uncertain. So they're hanging in there. They're hanging in there. They might be fine, sort of, but they're hanging in there. And the families that are not hanging in there, that are swinging just below that, are having to make decisions. Do I pay for my prescription, or do I pay for my mobile phone, or do I pay the food bill? And when you have to make decisions like that routinely, it undermines your ability to manage yourself and your family, because the stress that you're under the whole time that that's happening is very difficult. It's sometimes said of societies that, of course, we're much better off than we were. Like, we're much better. People keep saying to me, but we have eradicated smallpox. And I keep saying, yes, but, that's not really the point. So there are advances in society. There are material advances. There's huge improvement if you look at the Human Capital Index, right? Equally, there's massive decline on the environmental. And, there are lots of things that are going on. But within that huge aggregate improvement, there's also a lot of misery hidden within those figures, and I think this is what Diane is talking about, and it's actually looking through to that's quite important.
Thank you. So,
what I really liked about this discussion is that a number of times climate change came up, because what we are leaving for the next generation is a whole different set of crises that we in our generation never had to contend with. There is a almost inevitability of negative impacts about climate change. One thing that bothers me is that in the climate change negotiation and in the climate change policy setting, young people really have no place, they have no voice. Is there any argument or what is the better way of modifying or reforming these institutions and processes to get young people's voices in?
I think this goes back to the earlier discussion we had actually about how to get young people actively engaged in politics. And so we talked a bit about the formal channels. Another idea there is to reduce the voting age. One of our colleagues, David Runciman, suggested it ought to be 6, which may be a little low for most people, but perhaps reduce it from 18. But there are other ways to think about organising social change, as we've touched on previously. And I don't know, Prashant, if you want to come in on non-parliamentary ways of bringing young people in.
I mean, I think the thing is, our young people really care about climate change. When you think about the actual landscape of talking about climate change, I mean, there are lots of individuals that I know in this room talk about climate change, and their voices really deserve to be heard. And I'm going to come back to education, because I think one of the things that happens, with the mic, that happens with climate change is that there's this perception that particularly youth who are very, very active about climate change, that they're sort of tree-hugging toddlers, in a sense, that are having a tantrum about the fact that it's a hot day. And that's an enormous misperception, because what it means is that we're actually not understanding the different domains that are affected by climate change. And just to give a few that you may or may not know, so we've seen that climate change is eroding indigenous identity. We've seen that in India particularly, climate change and extreme heat is affecting fetal development, that actually during pregnancy, a woman is much more likely to experience conditions such as preeclampsia or have a stillborn child if we continue at this rate of climate change. And our young people do know this. So it's actually about looking at the youth movements, pay attention to the youth movements. What are on those signs? Why are these young people skipping school or chaining themselves to fences just to be heard? It's this paradox that I find, that no one likes someone who shouts, but equally no one's willing to listen to the words that the person is shouting. And I feel that's how young people feel, as though we've been put in a car, all of our natural resources have been sort of squandered away. That car is hurtling towards a barrier with the brakes ripped out and we can't get out and no one is listening to us. So I think the first thing to do is actually look at all of the data that young people have put out, what they have written, what they have created collages of. And even young people as tiny as 6 are doing this in primary schools. Look at that. While politicians need to say we're going to actively listen to that, and then we build the relationships and people will come together. And it comes down to trust as well. No, as I said, no one likes to shout, but sometimes it's necessary to be heard and to be listened to.
So one of the things that was very successful in the UK was the Climate Change Assembly. And there were many of them across the UK, and they brought together people to discuss climate change. And actually these communities came up with very, very powerful ways of dealing with some of the climate issues, including governance issues at the local level. Where those assemblies fell apart was that there was then no way of linking what it was that the citizens were saying to any kind of parliamentary procedure or any aspect of anything that any ministry or department was planning to do. So we need to close that gap. We also need to think about, for example, with young people who are, in universities and in work, actually providing them with the ability to take part in those climate assemblies because they take place over days. And so you would need to have some mechanism of paying a living day of the living wage or whatever it is to get people into that space. And I think the more we do that, there's been another very good consultation that's just gone on across the UK, done by the Food and Countryside Commission, which has been about dialogues on food. In fact, Cambridge has been part of it. And there, what we see people saying is that they say, we're not interested in this argument about the nanny state. Forget that. We need the government to do something, right? We need better quality food. There has to be a subsidy so that people who don't have enough money can actually have good quality food, not an idea that everybody has to have cheap food, because otherwise poor people can't have the food they want. So that conversation is changing the way we'd actually manage our food, but we're not really listening to it.
Okay. Right. One last question. There's a vote. You've won.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much to the panel. I really appreciate the angle of collaboration that has been brought through and the reminder of the continuum and the reoccurrence of what humanity does. The young people have always been this or that way since 300 years or more, from Leopardi's poem about the young people. But there's an aspect I'd like us to consider or throw away, that it is possible that there's a social-biological factor or some factors that might make us conclude that rather than manage the new young people as a continuum, but look at them as a totally different species of what humanity or the earth has ever seen. I say this because when you link together some factors like, for example, the access to information that humanity has never seen before, this availability of information, and also if you look at the fact that it is possible to have a platform and speak to millions of people without going through the formative years. It is possible to copy and paste things that you do not even know the source of them or the reason of them. And the fact that it is possible to live a life and never live with grandparents or have intergenerational conversations. Or for the fact that it's possible to, at a very young age, have an exposure to the whole world. Be in Cambridge or London and have friends in Mumbai, Kenya, or anywhere. These traits, I believe, gives us reason to consider if we're not dealing with a new set of human beings totally, regardless of what they have in common with the past. Because actually, humanity has never faced that before. And this very unique identity, in good or bad, I forgot to add the fact that never in humanity as we have people so free from bias without prejudice. It's also, that is good, but it's so new that I think we might need to think of those socio-biological effects to see, are we dealing with something totally new?
Okay, so we've got very little time for a giant new question. So I'd just ask if each panelist who wants to speak to this just says one thing, briefly.
I'm happy to take that away as a thing to reflect on. It's a huge question.
It is, and in a way, it sounded really important, and it's hard to respond quickly. It's a huge examination question you've set us.
But I do think I'm not sure about the the sort of sociobiological argument, but I do think, and as I said at the beginning, that this is a generation with unparalleled access to knowledge, a generation that is possible. A number of people when I was having a cup of tea told me that I was probably wrong about this, but I'm going to say it again anyway. The least prejudiced generation we've ever had on the planet, because the most experienced with diversity, precisely because of the kinds of things that you've been talking about. And I think that that this gives us great hope, because humans are fundamentally social. What we do really well is that we get together. So at the moment, we're having problems about getting together, but what we can do is we can solve a lot of problems by getting together. We just need to get together.
Shanti, do you want the last word?
The last word, oh my goodness. Again, I echo Professor Moore's comment on whether there's a socio-biological differentiation. I do think that what young people have now, even though there were remnants of the past, the face of the challenge is new. So social media at your fingertips, and from as young as being able to hold an iPad, you have that information literally right at the end of your digit is something that is new, that is different. But I would say that while we need to see that as an opportunity, the core thing is not to forget how we're linked to everyone in the past. That is also an opportunity. And I think what we just need to do is take this entire debate, as I think we've done tonight, and we've done it together, is to say that while there are differences, that is going to be our true triumph in what otherwise seems a very trying landscape.
And on that note, please join me in thanking our panel.
Can I also say a big thank you to our chair? Debbie, thank you. And now please make your way over our new zebra crossing to the historic part of the college. Take time for a comfort break, but from 7 o'clock there will be drinks in the parlours alongside the hall, and then dinner in the dining hall at 7:30. But thank you very much indeed to all of our panelists.